SECfans.com, week 13, talking Clemson, South Carolina, and we're allowed to talk about Clemson because we've done a number of their games this year. We've indicated or illustrated that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about this football team, and now they're playing an actual SEC team again. We picked them to beat Auburn. It's a little different story with the South Carolina team. It's a little bit different makeup than the Auburn team they played early on, but let's get into this game. Clemson has had a kind of quiet 10-1 season to this point. They've got South Carolina left on their schedule and already got their ticket punched to play Miami the following weekend. Let's do kind of a high level 50,000 foot on both of these teams. 50,000 feet, I should say, on both of these teams. Clemson, after the loss to Syracuse and getting Kelly Bryant back, what have they done? And then South Carolina, for the uninitiated Clemson fans, let's talk a little bit about what South Carolina has done, comprehensively this year.
Clemson as a football team has kind of risen or fallen with the ability to leverage their quarterback run to turn into the quarterback pass. And it's a trend in football right now. We saw Notre Dame fall flat on their face when their quarterback couldn't run the ball. Last year, we kind of saw Alabama fall flat on their face in the Clemson game when their quarterback couldn't run the ball. I find it interesting that while I think Bryant has a lot of arm talent, and I'm not discrediting him when I say this, that Clemson sort of adopted the Alabama offensive model this year, where they have a run-first quarterback, a run-first attack, and they really leverage the quarterback as a play-action passer. Obviously, he's a lot better throwing down the field, I think. I'm not saying he is Jalen Hurts. There's a lot of differences there, but they are a run-first football team. But my concern with Clemson is, and it has been, what happens when the defense gets strained beyond the defensive line. And I brought up that as an issue in the Virginia Tech game. I think I'll go ahead and note we've done several Clemson games this year. I think we've done 3, and we predicted all of them correctly. And I actually predicted the actual score of the Virginia Tech game. But in the comments of the Virginia Tech game, that I, again, actually predicted the score to be 31-17, I took a lot of criticism because I said I felt like the back 7 could potentially be exploited. I didn't feel like they were necessarily dominant. That ended up being the story when they lost to Syracuse. Syracuse really just kind of got them in the passing game. They got to the linebackers in the second level, and they're good players, but they're beatable. And I don't think Clemson is beatable at the defensive line, but teams late in the season have been able to give them a little bit more issues, particularly North Carolina State and Syracuse, when they were able to strain things. And Clemson, without their quarterback, when they've had to be a more traditional offense, the other thing I said is I felt like Clemson necessarily wasn't dominant outside their offensive line. They've had some real sparks later in the year. Etienne has been a great running back for them, but I think Deion Kane is a very good receiver. I don't think he's Mike Williams. I don't think he can take over a game. I think he's just a very consistent threat. But outside that, to me, at the skill positions, I don't know how scary they really are. They just have to use that offensive line. And some people may think it's weird because they have issues, but they put a lot of strain on them. They give a lot of 5-man protections. But if you can do a 5-man protection and put 4 guys out wide, have a running back in the backfield, it's a lot of responsibilities for a defense. And most teams they play can't quite handle it. So when they're able to do that and leverage the running quarterback in those situations, most teams just don't have the ability to adjust across the field. And that's what we've seen, the highs and lows, in my opinion, from Clemson. Things like Florida State, when they played teams that are very good athletically, that game was close for a while, and eventually Clemson got ahead. The defense got tired, and again, they just got too strained and couldn't maintain their priorities. And frankly, Florida State's given up this year regardless. Flipping the coin, talking about South Carolina. South Carolina is the most weird-ass team you could possibly imagine. We can't explain it. The first several games this year, we talked about, I've never seen a team consistently win when they're outgained and lose when they outgain their opponent. The North Carolina State game, the Missouri game, the Kentucky game, those games were all won by the team that got outgained. North Carolina State game, they got outgained 2-1, and they beat North Carolina State. And it's kind of progressed the whole year. There's no rhyme or reason to their successes. You look back at it, and yeah, they scored 28 points against Florida. Florida's given up. I get that, but 48 points against Arkansas. Okay, wow. The next week, 15 points against Tennessee. Is Tennessee's defense really better than Arkansas's? I don't really know if that's true. 24 points against Texas A&M early in the season. 17. They lost 24-17 to what was at the time a very good Texas A&M team. It's almost impossible to reconcile all their games. But the one thing I will say throughout the stretch of the season is they've generally done a very good job of shortening games, playing ball control. They maximize point production off turnovers. They minimize the amount of points they give you off turnovers. And they can take not a lot of production and they can score a lot of points. And they can win games despite the fact that they didn't really do all that great statistically. Uh, even you look at, just it's hard to even express because there's so many weird results. South Carolina 28, Florida 20, and you look at that score. South Carolina outgained Florida 470 yards to 300. That wasn't close statistically. Florida had 78 yards rushing in that game, and South Carolina won by 8. And yet, they have other games, like the Missouri game. In the Missouri game, Missouri outgained them 423 to 359. South Carolina won the game 31-13. They won by 3 touchdowns. So I know I'm kind of rambling a bit, but the thing I want to express with South Carolina, and it's to a certain extent kind of a word of caution, South Carolina cannot be pegged to the quality of their wins or losses. You can't peg them statistically to how they're going to perform based off their rush totals or pass totals. It's been, in their own way, they're the most chaotic team in college football. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, and as they did this week again, they have continually broken our model because their trends make absolutely no sense from anything that should happen from a predictive aspect in football.
I want to talk a little bit about Clemson and their Clemson for Clemson fans. Sorry for the Z again. That's how I say it. I've not. Is it fair to say that I've not been super impressed with them since the Syracuse game and since Kelly Bryant came back? And I ask you this question, but I'm going to back it up with a little data. You talk about, and we've talked about it all year, how disparate how weird the NC State and South Carolina game was. But if you look at Clemson and their production in that game, Kelly Bryant, 5 yards per attempt. Yes, they had 6.4 yards on the ground per carry, but they were outgained, I think, by almost 100 yards. And even still, you've got 105 yards from Feaster, 88 yards from Bryant on the ground, and then 191 yards from Kelly Bryant in the air, and they got 38 points. And then you look at Florida State. So 5 again, perfect, even 5 yards per attempt from Bryant, 4.4 yards rushing. But they got 31 points. So they're doing a little bit of the South Carolina game where somehow they're scoring points that aren't in keeping with their production statistically. Could that indicate, and we're not, their record speaks for itself. 10-1 is a good record in a good conference. It's really hard to knock that. But are these things, when we talk about how you are scrutinized when you're at the college playoff level, you're going to get scrutinized more than if you're Kentucky who's trying to make a bowl? Are these kind of leading indicators to tell us that maybe they're not as dominant as their 10-1 record would indicate?
I think so. I think Clemson gets a lot of respect, I think rightly, for the fact that they won what was, and now in retrospect, a very big win against Auburn. They've beaten the ranked teams on their schedule. But, like you said, it's troubling to us from a predictive aspect because they're not dominating teams statistically. Even when they win soundly on the scoreboard, there's a lot of struggle wins here, to take that, use that term. They were up 17-0 on Clemson in the Florida State at the half. Excuse me. It's not like that game was super, super close. But from a play-by-play aspect, it did kind of crawl back on them. There was a point in that game when it was 17-14. And when I say a point in that game, there was a point in the fourth quarter when it was 17-14 against Florida State. And you look at the final result, and it wasn't that close. But to a certain extent, with Clemson this year, the way I've seen it is Clemson, when they want to turn it on, just scores immediately, and they don't waste yardage. But for long periods of the game, they get kind of stuck in a rut. And football's a bit weird in that big plays result in points at a very high efficiency, meaning if you have a 100-yard run, it's guaranteed to be a touchdown. Lots of smaller plays may not necessarily result in any yardage. And an example we talk about a lot in the SEC right now is LSU. LSU had 7 yards per play against Troy and lost. They couldn't score 30 points in that game because they are such a grinded out team and they're so lacking in big plays at times. They can't generate any points from their offense. And if you have to grind out drives, negative plays have such an effect and a lot of other things come into play that it's really hard to put points on the board. You end up having a lot of wasted yardage. Clemson is such a sort of boom and bust team in a lot of ways that they can score points just like South Carolina can. Neither team is extremely consistent. Neither team has done a very good job of really grinding out drives, frankly. And so you end up with this result. I think you're right to call it into question. I think the ranking is merited from what they've done, but from a predictive aspect, if you're this boom or bust, if you're this dependent on big plays, that tends to be inconsistent. And inconsistency means you could lose any game at any time to any team. And it's really fascinating to me because we've got two teams that statistically are some of the most boomer bust, inconsistent, unpredictable teams in terms of how many points they score for their production in all of college football. And we have a rivalry game and a top 10 matchup in the last game of the year.
So that sounded like a segue. Why don't you go ahead and tell us what the computer makes of both of these teams and what the score comes out to?
Right. So the first thing we always talk about percentages allowed. Clemson fans have heard this. South Carolina fans have heard it. But as a recap, we look at per play averages. We look at your historical production. First, we note how you do versus your opponent's historical averages, meaning if all your opponents average on average 4 yards per carry, you allow six. If they all average 6 yards per carry, you allow four. You've allowed 75% of their opponent rush averages. So we're relational statistic for how good your defense is compared against opponent strength. Clemson is excellent. 69% of opponent rush averages. That's great. Anytime you're under 70%, you're an elite rush defense. And really that anytime you're under 70%, you're generally a nationally elite team in that unit. They give up 81% of opponent pass defenses. That's very good. That is not elite. You really need to be under 80% to be elite. 81% is very good, but it is beatable. It's not the units they were in the past, not quite what they have been. South Carolina is good. 89%, 90%, I think. Really, it's 89.5% of opponent rush averages and 93% of opponent pass averages. Those aren't fantastic numbers, but they're good numbers. And they're good defensively on both sides of the ball. Not elite in the way Clemson is, but very good. The difference in these two teams is really offensively. Clemson, 5.1 yard per carry average, 6.7 yard per attempt. South Carolina only averaging 3.96 yards per carry on the season. It's kind of amazing to have an SEC team, and especially an SEC team that only has 3 losses, that is not averaging 4 yards per carry. That's kind of rare, but it is what it is. They've somehow managed to do that. But 7.3 yards per attempt. I think another fascinating thing about these teams, and I'll note real quick, is Clemson runs more than they throw, and South Carolina throws more than they run. And given where they were at last year or in the past, and the idea of a Will Muschamp offense and the Dabo Swinney's spread attack, I don't think many people would anticipate that, but it's true. South Carolina is the more passing team, and Clemson is the more run team. And the predicted yardage in this game is 5.4 yards per play for Clemson and 4.4 yards per play for South Carolina. So Clemson has a full yard per play advantage. And as you would expect from this, of course, it's predicting an extremely close game. It actually has it Clemson 28, South Carolina 24. normally when you have a full yard per play advantage, 4.4 to 5.4, usually there's a bigger gap. But as we said, South Carolina continues to break our model because the less yardage South Carolina has, the more points they are predicted to have. Because bafflingly, South Carolina has scored more points in the games where they don't move the ball very well and have scored less points in the games where they do. The Louisiana Tech game, they had 6.5 yards per play. They only scored 17 points. Against Arkansas, they averaged over a yard per play less, 5.3 yards per play, and they scored 48 points. There is no rhyme, reason, or logic to the South Carolina Gamecocks. They are a bull in the china shop, and they're high on something because there's really no telling what they're going to do in any given moment.
I think some of it comes from the fact that throughout the year, back when Samuel was healthy and with this defense, they've been opportunistic in ways that didn't rely on the offense. Either it's defensive touchdowns against Arkansas or it's kick returns for touchdowns against NC State. They found ways to do that. And I think to be competitive in this game against Clemson, against this really good defense, best defense they've seen all year, and this is a team that's played Georgia, they're going to have to get one or two of these touchdowns. But because I think we talked about this last year with Alabama and their knots, that, that term you hate so much. Last year they did that. Isn't it right? They did it so much that you almost had to count for it in the statistical model because it was more likely to happen than not.
Yeah, that was absolutely true. It was so frequent that all their statistics were skewed, and we'd always mention they aren't expected to do that well from a replay sense, but it was basically giving them 7 to 10 points a game because it said, well, it doesn't really matter what they produce. They're going to score an extra touchdown or two through some random defensive or special teams play.
So given these weird, wacky statistics and how we've talked about in the past, that I think we had a model for, it was South Carolina and somebody, that if you gave South Carolina fewer yards per play than the model gave them, they would actually score more points. Given that weirdness, just in your gut, in your mind, is it crazy to say that it's equally as not shocking to see a Clemson win as it would be, a South Carolina win as it would be a Clemson 30-point blowout win?
I think it's very true. I mean, last year we talked about this and we didn't expect South Carolina to get blown out in that game to that extent that they did, and it happened. And I could see that happening again. I could see Clemson, this being an extremely close game, and South Carolina winning. And I think a lot of it is due to the fact that Brian Kelly is
Kelly Bryant.
Kelly Bryant, yeah,
unless Notre Dame's head coach is coming to play football.
Well, he might. You never know because he may be in need of a job soon, but he's a deep play boomer best guy, and we've talked about a lot that Bentley at South Carolina, I think in both of our views, he'll make an amazing play and then turn it around by missing 3 5-yard throws, and they're incredibly inconsistent. And you watch Bentley and you watch his highlights, you watch him on TV and he looks phenomenal, but be honest, when you watch him in a regular game and you watch that part that ESPN on their replays always cuts out where they skip ahead in the action, which is always the part where the defense is playing very well or somebody shows where they're inconsistent. Bentley misses a lot of routine plays in spurts. So you really have no idea if Bentley screws up a couple times and he's inaccurate, turns the ball over, all of a sudden they're down 17-0 and this goes crazy. And, Clemson just runs right over them. And maybe the opposite happens. Maybe Bentley makes an amazing couple series where he makes some crazy throws and hits tight ends like he can do, or throw the ball down the field and thread the needle, and all of a sudden they score. So, yeah, this is the most unpredictable game that I feel like we've covered the entire year, in that we can say statistically we don't know what will happen.
And even if we both think that Clemson is going to win this game, or if they're a heavy favorite, I actually haven't looked at the spread on this one. That's different from what we're saying when we say whether or not it's predictable, because we kind of adhere to the numbers, and when the numbers are this messed up, it makes our job a little bit harder. Okay, so before we give our final gut scores, I want to talk about this real quick. You said when we covered South Carolina and Georgia that you felt like Georgia is going to stymie most teams because of their defense. But if you were going to give a team a shot to beat Georgia, you want a quarterback like Jake Bentley and not a calm and steady 6.8 yard, 7.5 yard per attempt guy, maybe a Danny Etling or something like that. You want that guy that's going to maybe have lows, but also has the potential to have a lot more highs. Do you see that as the same in this game, where this is the guy you want if you want to take a South Carolina team in and win? Or has your thoughts changed on that post South Carolina, Georgia?
I think it's the same thought. If you're the guy that takes the easy 5 yard play, Clemson's too good to stop to really do anything. They're going to stop you doing that. They're going to keep you from getting to the edges. They're going to get production in terms of stopping your run. They're going to get negative plays, and they're going to shut you down. Our big thing in the Virginia Tech game was we picked a low score and a high score where we thought Virginia Tech was going to open it up and chunk it down the field and just take risks, because we felt like my statement was if Virginia Tech played the game straight, they're going to lose 31-17. That ended up being the exact score of the game because Virginia Tech played it straight. Bentley doesn't know how to play the game straight. He can't do it, and he won't do it. And Will Muschamp may play sort of Neanderthal football to a certain extent, but I think he knows he has to take risks in a game like this. If you want to beat the giant, if you want to beat the big team, you need to do things that increase chaos and weird probabilities. Ole Miss is a great example because they throw lots of vertical routes, and those are fairly low percentage plays, but they're also plays that can work on anybody. And when they do hit, they can generate immediately into points. So South Carolina, with the guy that they have that can make every throw on the field, is a lot better equipped to beat Clemson than, strangely, probably some better teams that are a lot more conservative, because with Clemson's front seven being what it is, they can stop you from being able to consistently march the field with, an LSU. But when they play a guy like Bentley that maybe doesn't have the surrounding talent, and they're really missing the fact that they don't have Debo in the passing game, they can still put the ball down in the air downfield, and they can do the same sort of thing Syracuse did, where they're just going to chunk it. And maybe they get lucky and it turns out like Syracuse. Maybe they get unlucky and it turns out like some of the other games that end up being a blowout, but at least you give themselves a shot.
All right, so give me your gut score. Is it in line with the model, or do you go somewhere else?
My gut score, honestly, looking at this, I think it's actually kind of in line with the model. I think it's going to be a little more. I want to say probably more like 28-21. But I do think this is going to be a close game. I think South Carolina's defense is solid, and I'm not necessarily sold that Clemson can put up a ton of points. And to sort of take one step back here, if you look at Clemson's average scoring, Clemson has been in the high 20s for a lot of games. Wake Forest, Syracuse, Georgia Tech. They were only 31 against Florida State, only 31 against Virginia Tech. So they've scored somewhere in that 28 to 31 range pretty consistently against decent teams. And likewise, South Carolina has found ways to score points. Their low in the season was 10 against Georgia. They scored only 13 against Kentucky. But again, Texas A&M 17 points, Arkansas 48, 15 against Tennessee. I think it's reasonable for them to hit about the 20 mark. So if that 28-21 thing sounds crazy, that's about where both teams have done against average to, an average good opponent. One scores about 28, one scores about 21.
I'm a little different, and that's mostly because I think that South Carolina's had some key injuries to some key players that have really limited them offensively, and it's, you can lose a Samuel earlier in the year and kind of make up for that in aggregate over the year. But I think they're just missing too much production. They're not deep enough in my mind to just not miss a beat, next man up kind of thing. I think this is an ugly game for three quarters, a lot like the Florida State game for Clemson. But I think that there's going to be more bust than boom for South Carolina offensively, which is going to lead to some short fields for the Tigers. So give me 24-14 Clemson, and it's like I don't know, 17-10, 17-7 kind of game going into the fourth quarter. Ugly throughout. Wouldn't be surprised if South Carolina won or played this tight, but I think South Carolina is going to try to shorten the game, try to do the Mississippi State versus Alabama model, but I don't think they have the running game to really keep this defense honest.
Yep, I would tend to agree with that.
All right, what else on this one before we move on?
Yeah, can't really think of anything.
All right, y'all, Clemson fans, you know the drill. I think we've done more games for you than we have South Carolina this year. Comments. We want the score. What do you think the score is going to be? Give us your MVP of the game. If you want to get into CFP chatter, we're certainly happy to mix it up with you as well. ACC versus SEC. There's going to be some trash talk.